dear participants. We are happy to welcome you today at our webinar, Climate Disclosure and Your Company, How to Be Ready, that organized by Chapter 0 Ukraine and Caucasus. Chapter 0 Ukraine and Caucasus is a part of Global Climate Governance Initiative, established by World Economic Forum. It is an initiative that mobilized boards and of directors around the world to address climate change in their business by developing and supporting national associations. The purpose of Chapter 0 Ukraine and Caucasus is to educate and activate board members to include climate issues into company strategies. Today, we decided to focus on new international climate requirements. For the last 2-3 years, we heard a lot of abbreviations and use, but what is common and what to expect? Who should be ready, and how is the practical, and what is the practical tips for the advanced international practices? So let's start our meeting and webinar. Please feel free to put your questions to the chat, and we will be happy to answer them after our short presentations. I hope you can see now my screen. So let's start. In first part of our webinar, we will focus on what should we expect from the climate target disclosure frameworks that comes into force. In survey of senior executives, 97% say that external shareholders have the most influence of the company ESG reporting and disclosure policies. These stakeholders understand that work is much bigger than a simple ticket box exercise. And investors want to know what the taken actions company do to in regards of climate change. So my name is Maryna Rymkina. I'm a manager and corporate governance and ESG service lead at Deloitte, Ukraine. More than 10 years ago, I have heard a first time about the sustainability. From that time, different aspects, risks, and strategies of company sustainability come into my focus. And today, I'm happy to start this our webinar. Before we dive into the nuts of bolts of companies, how should disclose the impact on climate, it's important to bring into force the biggest picture of ESG business imperative of long-term value created, as well as stakeholders' expectations that are driving it. And now you can see on the slide a lot of frameworks and requirements that, as for now, comes into our big international world of ESG. As Gartner wrote it in 2022 report, ESG is the top 10 risk area for international audit departments focused in 2022. Over the past 2 years, doubled the institutional investors have committed to investing responsibility. They incorporated ESG data into investment analysis and decisions. More credits and issuing loans that adjust rates according to ESG performance. Employees and consumers are signaled that will end relations with poor performing organizations. In December 2015, near 200 governments agreed to address climate changes by holding and signed the Paris Agreement. Most organizations clear that they will implement the ESG according to 2021 Audit Board survey. Over 900 risk and compliance professionals said that they understand that climate risk and ESG risk is significant and or moderated, have a moderated impact to their company. But what organizations do now, and many of them still at the early stage of ESG readiness. So what is climate change and why it matters for our companies? In 2022, the World Economic Forum identified climate action as to be the most risk for the global over the next 10 years. And this is the first main reason. The next one is demand from investor side. Many investors are now expected that the companies still invest to the companies and should invest to the companies that know how to address climate change. And the last, but not the least element is in our points is the TCFD becoming a regulatory requirement. So we know that, for example, in UK, from the last years, it becoming one of the main requirements for the companies. And today we also will look for another examples of requirements for climate change disclosures that come and for the near future. For example, if we are talking about TCFD already, it was the first established in 2017. The brief that capital and of the companies companies should mostly focus on climate change. If they don't know how to address what risks come with climate change to their business, they will not manage them, and they are not interesting for the investors. As well as providing a means for more effective disclosure, TCFD provides participants, organizations with the opportunity to transform their business and embedded systematic resilience. So TCFD mostly focus on on 4 main pillars and 11 recommendations that mentioned in their papers. From the last report that they published in 2022, we could see that the most companies started to disclose more and more elements and recommendations that required by TCFD. For example, in EU, this percent of companies started from previous year was in a half lower than in this year. But also we can see that more and more companies started to disclose not only half or maybe one requirements, but they started to disclose all 11 elements. So what is successful disclosure for the companies? First of all, it's investors think that they should disclose all 11 requirements. Another one is business should be engaged, and stakeholders have been identified and educated on climate risks, including management and board. Another thing that identified data is started collected. Getting this will prepare the organization for more detailed and specific climate disclosure, likely to be mandated to better requirements. But what is the next? Task force, so our TCFD reminds concerns and that not enough companies disclosing their climate impact. Over the next several months, TCFD progress is planning to collect more information about the companies that's starting to disclose their information, and plan in October 2022 prepare the next report that will be collected the best practices. Also, to those who plan to, for example, implement but don't know how to start to do it with TCFD, we recommended to deep dive into the reports based on the best practices. So not only annual reports, but also something like collection of best practices. What about another jurisdictions? So currently you can see that almost in different countries, in different jurisdictions, new regulations, climate related, come into force. Sometimes they name it by ESG regulations. However, in each of them, if we see that it's required to disclose climate risks, opportunities, management approach, some strategies related to climate, we could name it like climate requirements. For example, growing numbers of European countries adopting national climate laws and demonstrate a strong and growing consequences that robust national ownership and responsibilities to achieve climate neutrality is critical for delivery. The quality of national climate governance matters just as much being the bedrock for reach any target. Active move forward from the voluntary frameworks to obligatory requirements started nearly 2 years ago. At this slide, you could see that some of the key steps, for example, mandatory TCFD disclosures for UK listed companies that I mentioned some minutes earlier, was one of those steps. And let's today focus and start to looking from this point. Members of this case will come back but we will come back to this in a while. Also noted that starting from January 2021, a lot of statements from different organizations, for example, that you saw one of the first slides, CDP, GRI, and SASB, TCFD, they intend to work together towards implementing corporate reporting under the climate issue on a comprehensive system. And also, this is like a second steps that you can see on this slide. Another examples how this trend to mandatory disclosure comes and started like a mainstream in our agenda. The main elements that on this slide also is to understand that it's not only was one step in our history, but it's a continuous process, and almost we not focus on each step that was on during these 2 years, but the main critical on this slide. And let's start our deep analyzing of disclosure that comes into the next years from the last point. So let's look from for ICSB, IFRAC, and SEC requirements. First of them, this is a requirement that comes from FRS. So what should we expect from new FRS standards? FRS sustainability disclosure were published for public consultation on March 2022 by the International Sustainability Standard Board. So this was like 2 papers that you can see on the screen. First one is general requirements for disclosure of sustainability related financial information, and second one, this is climate related disclosure. Let's a little bit about each of them. First one, this is like overall requirements which objective the disclosure of sustainability related financial information that is useful for primary users and entities in general. So for those of you who already know what is, for example, GRI or some general requirements, this is a little bit the same when you try to focus and to present, to disclose your general information about the climate change. The second one, climate-related disclosure, second paper, this is more the same like we can see in TCFD, while this paper requirement from the companies that will disclose information based on climate-related information based on IFRS standards. They should disclose greenhouse gas, for example, transition risks, physical risks, climate-related opportunities, and another elements that was also required by first by TCFD. The interesting point that this is reporting is required to be something similar that we have as for now from financial reported requirements by TCFD. Entity will be required to disclose information required as part of general purpose from financial reporting. let's also look for some reporting principles that this is something different that we have as for now in our frameworks. Sustainability-related financial disclosures should provide information on the same reporting entity as general proposed financial statement. So the main idea that have the same scope that companies published in financial reporting, and the same in should be disclosed in climate-related. Use the currency of financial statements the same in both of reports. Disclosed material information should be significant sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Also, one of the new trends that you will see and that we will discuss with you today, this is the high demand of to be transparent in full value chain. So it's proposed to be defined the full range of activities. Companies should start to disclose information not about themselves and collect scopes information and disclose, but also from the different participants in different organizations in their value chain. They should avoid unnecessary duplications. So this means if, for example, some governance elements are disclosed in financial reporting or any other elements of that required by IFRS, then in parts of when companies start to disclose climate-related information, they should not double this one. Fair representation, so companies, so expected that companies will also present not only information that they have positive, but also shows the negative and shows the difference and how they try to resolve any issues that they have related to climate issues. One of the important things that we also will see from the another topics, materiality. Materiality judgments involves both quantitative and qualitative considerations. And the last things for IFRS that disclosure comparative information in respect of previous period for all disclosures should be in line with the current period. So the same like we can see in GRI. If something is changed in your information in previous period, you should make some comments to that and also disclose and to make it comparable for the current period of disclosure. For example, we will also focus on SEC requirements that issue, but they also issued the statement that they will support work with IFRS to in the for further improvement of such sustainability disclosure standards. Let's move on for European Union and what we have here new. European Council and European Parliament have agreed on the next for this CSFD amending for EU non-financial reporting directive. A few words about this non-financial reporting directive who already maybe not heard about it. So this was requirements for disclosure of information on the way for specific companies operated and managed social and environment challenges. This is included information regarding some environment matters, social and in respect for human rights. Also, it involves some information, for example, like for anti-corruption, for diversity of company boards, and another governance requirements. This was a mandatory annual reporting and applied to large public interest companies with more than 500 employees. Key objectives for the new directive that we now discussed is to improve sustainability reporting, and was like a next steps that came from the previous developed requirements. The information also will be mandatory. The main things that they plan to make wide scope of the companies that should be should disclose information, and they should disclose some climate related information. So more I see that we have some questions. We are happy to answer them as far as after our presentation. Few more things about European standard sustainability reporting standards that will be required to use for the European companies. Now you can see that how these new requirements changed the requirements that was before. So the non-financial reporting directive. In 2022, it was previous like date of period when we expected that this requirements come into force. However, a lot of discussion and a lot of comments that already European organizations received from the stakeholders who would like to discuss in one side, and another side this was like not developed all the requirements, for example, for some of the sector specific. That's why the date of when these requirements will be mandatory, they will not not from the beginning from 2022 for 23, but when we will look on the next slide. Also, you can see that the format of from the various non-financial sustainability disclosure reporting was like an annual reporting. In this new standards and in new requirements, we expected that it would be mandatory by annual reporting, but not for everyone, and not for all companies. It would be also based on the listed or not listed company, the size, the number of people, and their capital. Let's see what we have about these requirements. So IFRAC published already some papers, and what we have four main parts. So one of them, like for example, we just briefly discussed in FRS, general disclosure. The same we can see in these standards, like a cross-cutting requirements. And another approach that we used from, for example, GRI standards. This is three elements of that company should disclose, like environmental, social, and governance. Each of them also have some different elements that include deep dive requirements for disclosure. Would like to mention that you can see on previous slide, and also here we put the same, that approximately a lot of companies required to use IFRS, and it's if we compare from the previous disclosure requirements, it's like in more than five businesses more than we have before that. Now you can see also the three groups for which for each of them we will see different timing of required implementation, different approach for disclosure, and some elements that they can avoid, for example, in their disclosure. These three groups, like you can see three elements, like characteristics that will help you to understand to which of the groups you should move, and which requirements you should take to your company. So about these requirements more. When to start? The companies first who should start to implement and to disclose their information, it would be the large listed company, and they should, as for now timing, in 2025, they should disclose their information starting from the previous year, so for 2024. If we're talking that we are now in 2023, so the time to be prepared to disclose information, it's not so much. And these companies that we know already will start to prepare themselves. Another requirements, another time for small, medium listed and not listed companies. And another group that it's interesting to understand that in each of the new requirements for climate disclosure, we have such group that is in this case, non-EU capital groups, but in others that, for example, it's not required to use these standards, but in some value chain of the company, they comes and they start to be like related to the main company. So based on the new standards, it should be disclosed as an annual management report. And the interesting thing that also common in all new standards that we can see now, this is assurance, and assurance that come and become mandatory for everyone who is disclosed non-financial information. So in SRSS requirements, we are starting from limited assurance, but you can see that starting from 2028, this will be reasonable assurance and this will be mandatory. So what should be disclosed? Briefly, the same that we can see in GRI, we can see in SASB sector-specific standards, and currently these standards already have some developed and in the process of consultation of further improvement of standard-specific standards. We can see high priority for value chains, for disclosure, stakeholders engagement, for full determining and choosing the scope that will be also the same in financial disclosure and the same in non-financial. Mandatory identification of impact risks and opportunities related to climate, and some mentioned to use some required timeframes. This is very interesting and not predictable one. While we understand that, for example, biodiversity, water, and other some requirements, they already developed something and they're in the consultation phase. However, we expected that in near future, SRS may provide other timeframes. For example, like we can see companies propose some goals to achieve in 2015 for the decarbonization strategies and for example, to put for yourself some goals. And the last but very interesting point, this is double materiality. This is maybe the most different elements that we can see here, but the high priorities that we have in each of the standards, that we should focus on material topics that company already have and that they try to understand for themselves. In these standards, we should see and understand and not only impact topics, but also their financial part. So from both sides, financial and impactful. And the last requirements that come into force, this is from our from US, this is SEC requirements. You can see that these requirements started to be developed a long time ago. So for 2010, maybe one of the earliest one. In previous year, March 2022, SEC issued and proposed some draft rules that would be standardized the climate-related disclosure. In these requirements, they also ask companies to show their scope 1 and 2. Scope 3, it's not mandatory to be disclosed. However, if company analyzed and put them as a mandatory disclosure, they should disclose it. And for example, if they have any goals related to reduce scope 3, they should also disclose this information. Also, additional information related to governance of climate-related risks and risk management. Proposals, a lot of proposals and rules now in the stage of comments. And what we can see that, and what we heard, the next step in SEC climate-related disclosure, this is another rules that they decided to develop and started to discuss with big audience. This is related to governance remuneration, that also common in each of the requirements that we discussed with you today. And also this is some requirements for human capital that interesting that companies should disclose their information about in this area also as well. So let's sum up what we have in our new legislation area. So in 2023, we will watching the new climate target disclosure frameworks that move toward implementations. So companies start to be prepared and start to prepare for further improvements, how to use, how to adjust what they have already, and how to be prepared and what to do the next. We know that European Sustainability Report Standards, SRSS that we discussed, proposed by FRAC, were the most detailed, and they are asking companies to report fully on 11 from the 12 areas as to be assessed. All three frameworks are required to disclose the basic targets information, such as target year, type, scope. However, neither IFRS or SEC ask companies to fully report on more detailed measures, such as whether or not their targets align with science-based criteria. On the slide, you can see the brief gaps identified by MCSI in their report in 2022. So we expected that organizations some of them should disclose in 1 or 2 years, starting from now, and maybe also some of them will be disclosed. Some of them will be disclosed as related companies to the main organizations. So I suppose for those of you who join our webinars today, it's critical to understand that time to act and time to understand which requirements you should apply, should use, is now. And let's be more climate friendly. Thank you for your attention for the first part of our webinar. I'm happy to answer your questions if there are any. I can see one question, but let's move a little bit after our practical discussion. I think we will partially cover it during our next section and next discussion. So I'm thank you for this part, and I'm welcome to invite now our second speaker. This is Silke Goldberg, partner of Global Head of ESG, and Silke today came to us from Chapter 0, United Kingdom. Silke, are you with us? You could share your experience and maybe some practical tips for the companies, how to be ready, and yeah, what is the next steps? What should we expect? Silke?
Thank you very much, Maryna. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. And or should I say, дуже дякую за запрошення. I'm very honored to be here, and at least virtually. And I will talk to you a little bit about what companies can do in order to get ready. So this will be a little bit more practical. I'm not going to talk about the various climate change or ESG disclosure regulations. I'm talking about what duties do companies have generally, and how can they practically go about it. I will try and share my screen, if I may.
Yes, sure.
So let's see.
Silke, is it meant to be that we cannot see you, or is that?
That is not no, that is not the plan. I just simply don't know how to make it so that you can see me.
That's
voila.
super. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, I wasn't trying to hide, promise. Okay. Oh, now I can see myself as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about directors' duties and ESG disclosure. Why do I talk about directors' duties? Because simply every single jurisdiction across Europe has similar sort of, and also elsewhere, they have similar sort of duties for directors, how to go about in running their company. So let's have a look. Typically, directors' duties go to, they need to act within their powers, they need to promote the success of their company, and exercise independent judgment and avoid conflicts in relation to their own position and the company. They also generally, and this is often phrased differently in each jurisdiction, but broadly there's a duty to exercise reasonable care, skill, and diligence, as well as the need to protect the confidentiality of their data and general company strategies. They also have a specific overview management duty, which means they are, of course, responsible for the day-to-day decision making, and they need to put in place internal systems and controls in order to comply with all relevant obligations and all laws. And this is where the link to climate change disclosure and ESG disclosure becomes really important. Likewise, they need to account and have company records which are accurate and filed in a timely manner. So, for instance, the many different disclosure schemes that Maryna has talked about just earlier that are about to come into force in a number of different jurisdictions across Europe really sort of make it clear that companies should comply with these and prepare an ESG or climate change disclosure report. For instance, one of the many things we're doing in what I'm doing in my day job is help companies review those reports and make sure they are in compliance. The issue here for the director's duties in this context is that all of a sudden they don't only have to think about, is the company profitable? Are they generally in compliance with whatever local law, European Union law, OECD guidelines, or whatever else? But they also need to think about climate change in a really active way. And in Europe, there's a duty of care imposed by the Climate Change Disclosure Directive to take into account the consequences on decisions on human rights and climate change and the environment. And in addition, many European as well as sort of voluntary frameworks impose additional reporting and disclosure requirements. Therefore, the internal systems that the directors need to, as part of their duties, put into place need to be updated in order to adapt for this relevant information that is being captured here, that is being required. Why is this important? And I hope you can still sort of, is the next slide, can you see this slide?
Yes,
okay, so there's a small delay on my computer, sorry for that. So because if not, many jurisdictions have liability regimes for directors. So for instance, there might be a breach of duty, there might be potential personal liability, or in some jurisdictions also a risk of disqualification. Some jurisdictions have consequences such as the potential civil and criminal offences, as well as a risk of liability for third parties in certain circumstances. And here in particular, we see the risk of ESG and climate change related litigation. So for instance, in my day job, I'm currently helping a client who's being, not going to say where, but who is under investigation for not having correctly disclosed what they needed to disclose in relation to carbon emissions and climate change. So therefore, we're now helping them how to effectively get that particular company ready in order to comply with the relevant laws. But how, Maryna had asked me to talk specifically about how do companies get ready and what should directors do in these circumstances. First of all, and this is not really perhaps a surprise, directors really need to get to grips and understand in detail the operational activities of the business. This is in particular the case if you have non-executive directors, and Chapter 0 in particular supports non-executive directors across a number of listed companies, really. And because often non-executive directors might have specific sector expertise, or they might have come in for governance expertise in another sector, and that should be really sort of cross-applied. So directors need to make it their business to really, really understand the operational activities. They also then need to make sure that a robust governance system is in place so that they can identify, assess, and respond to material business risk. And climate change risks are material business risks. And then sort of the directors need to really maintain an understanding of how business standards in relation to ESG factors evolve. Give you an example. I had a client many years ago who, for the first time, linked the director's duties pay to a reduction in emissions, in CO2 emissions. At the time, that was an outlier. However, this has now become so mainstream. There's so many companies, certainly in the UK, in Australia, and also in the US and Europe, who are having those sort of KPIs for directors, that the business standard has evolved. Now, if you have a company that doesn't link or that doesn't have a KPI in this area, they might need to ask questions as to, or they will get asked questions as to why they do not have this. Directors need to be sure that they have a good understanding of current policies and practices and challenge their companies as to whether they're actually in compliance. They also need to ensure that management seek appropriately qualified and independent advice. So not every board will have a climate change expert, for instance. You don't necessarily need to, but you then need to go and, I don't know, in Ukraine, go and phone Maryna and get independent and qualified independent advice in particular areas, involve advisors, technical advisors in particular, and or economic advisors who can help you with benchmarking exercises. Also, it is important that climate change and ESG disclosures are brought to the board level discussion on a regular basis. So, for instance, a few years ago, some clients of mine had a climate change committee But the issue was that the Climate Change Committee never really talked to the board, or there was very little link between board level discussions and Climate Change Committee. So this is in particular an issue because then the company will say, oh, but we have this Climate Change Committee and they're dealing with the disclosure. If the board doesn't know, and if the board has no impact and no supervision in relation to that, first of all, the recommendations of that particular committee might not necessarily be translated appropriately into board policy. The board isn't able to supervise appropriately, and the directors of that board might actually be in a situation where they are in violation of their directors' duties. Out of the many different disclosure items that Maryna has described in her presentation, one of the things that comes out in particular is that there is an enormous amount of data that flows, that needs to be disclosed, or perhaps first of all established, ordered, and then disclosed. And here we need to ensure that there is sufficient information flow within the company, within both financial and non-financial reporting procedures. So effectively, companies need to set up a back office reporting procedure that enables the disclosure in the first instance. Oh, indeed, somebody has just shared Chapter 0 Ukraine governance websites, and that is excellent information because that will help sort of providing some of the context for how climate change governance might be put into place for companies and how that should be done in terms of best practice. In Maryna's presentation, there was a lot of detail about the various standards, and these standards, there are many, many standards. One of the issues for companies is to establish, to the extent that they're not subject to a particular standard. For instance, TCFD in the UK is now a mandatory standard for listed companies and also for companies that are not listed but that are above a certain size. But there are many other standards. So it is important to know which standard you're reporting to, and then work effectively backwards and work through the different requirements and be clear as to whether you're reporting on any of these categories in relation to climate change. And the way that we have worked with our clients and the way that we're recommending this is to do this through disclosure of sort of effectively an internal due diligence. And this goes to how exactly can you be ready. So this is on this next slide. So we recommend, sort of generally the recommendation is that companies should analyze in detail, what do I actually need to report, or what can I report? This is an important difference because there are also some risks in over-reporting. So for instance, a couple of years ago, we had a company that kept on disclosing a lot of climate change and ESG related matters that did not correspond to any actual reporting obligation, which led to the fact that they were under disclosing in relation to the standard to which they needed to report, and they were over disclosing, but not in a particularly methodological way, and thereby sort of effectively incurring the risk that further scrutiny was invited and actually sort of then regulators taking an interest as well. So the first step really is identify all the requirements to which you're subject, and then identify the relevant information that you need. For many companies, in particular at the beginning of the climate change and ESG journey, that will require a form of internal due diligence. So where is the information? How do I establish the carbon footprint? Where does the strategy sit? Sort of where do the people in our organization sit with the relevant information? And that is really a key step from a practical perspective. Then the next step is allocate responsibility. Make sure that you know, and everybody else knows, who in your company is in charge of implementing the disclosure obligations and who owns that particular task going forward. It could be the board, it could be the corporate social and sustainability officer, it could be various different departments, but it's important where it is several departments who perhaps own a part of it. Let's say the technical measurement of how to establish your scope 1, 2, and 3 obligations, and somebody else is in charge of I don't know, carbon credit accounting or EU ETS compliance, that ultimately all of this is brought together. So, and that's what it does, that what shouldn't happen is that responsibility is getting lost across in the company, and that's everybody somehow thinks it's the responsibility of the other department. We have seen this quite a lot. Again, as the market matures, companies are maturing as well in their attitude and in the way that they're taking responsibility for this. So, for instance, 5 years ago, we were advising a company who thought they had climate change responsibility, but they had it literally all over the company. It was a very large company with many subsidiaries, and lots of different subsidiaries were effectively relying on doing disclosure or preparing disclosure or having information for their little business, but they didn't have the overall view. Establishing the overall view and enabling the directors at group company level to take that responsibility and to disclose in relation to or in line with the reporting obligation is absolutely key. One of the key issues is also timing in relation to the disclosure. Sometimes this takes a lot more time than actually thought. So in the same way that you prepare your annual report as you would normally for a company, on an annual, basically immediately after you've published, many companies, of course, start again for the next cycle. This is something that we also recommend in relation to climate change. I've now seen a couple of questions from Ihor Olepov. If it's okay, Maryna, shall I answer these now, sort of at this point, because they seem relevant? Is that all right?
If they're relevant, so please feel free to answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the question is, I'm just going to shout it out again. So what should the board do if they understand that the disclosures would result, almost for certain, in fines, litigation against the company, which is likely to result in the bankruptcy of the company? Well, the difficulty is, Ihor, if I may, that if the disclosure is obligatory and the board doesn't disclose, then in addition to the risk of litigation and fines and possible bankruptcy, the board directors will also have, depending on the local jurisdiction, and I'm just speaking, I'm UK and German qualified, so I'm just speaking from this perspective. Under both UK and German law, that would be illegal. If you have an obligatory disclosure requirements and you choose not to do it because of fear of the consequences, then the directors might be personally liable. There have been some stories where directors themselves have been fined and also imprisoned. It really depends on the local regime. But I think this is a risky strategy for the directors. So next level is, which level of liability is greater? Liability for failing to disclose or liability for leading the company's bankruptcy? Again, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Because it would depend on the local law. I think I'm a bit sort of, I don't see it as a binary alternative necessarily, but if you don't disclose and you need to disclose and you have a legal obligation to disclose, there is the risk of a personal fine. In the UK and Germany, also imprisonment under certain circumstances. And there could also be a separate category of offence, is basically being opaque about the risk of bankruptcy. Or so under German law in particular, that is an issue. I don't know whether that is an issue under Ukrainian law, for instance, or other regional laws. If you know that a company might go bankrupt and you basically pretend that it doesn't, that in some jurisdictions is absolutely a problem for directors as well. Ihor, does that actually address your question, or anybody else? Is that helpful by way of context?
Yes, okay, thank you very much. So I think we can move forward our presentation.
Great, thank you very much. So sort of this is a little bit more, sort of this continues in relation to how to implement disclosure obligations. So I said before, start early to anticipate delays, plan your disclosure across the year for the relevant deadline, and make sure that all relevant parties across the company know what is expected and required. We would recommend to get external advisors on board early to help with the drafting. I'm sure here many lawyers and otherwise appropriately qualified colleagues on sort of in the webinar, but generally the advice we're giving, get your external advisors on board early. It is very difficult for external advisors to come in and say, we've been called on, I've personally been called on 2 days before climate change report deadline, saying, hey, can you just please draft this, or can you please review our drafting? Is this okay? That makes it very difficult, and risks come out of that. Perhaps the most important advice here is don't get comfortable. Always review the market practice as it is evolving, and always review the most recent compliant guidance. This also means check what your competitors are doing. How do they disclose? What is, because that ultimately collectively establishes the market practice. Also, make sure that you schedule regular best practice training for all the involved teams, and be sure that this should put you in a position that you can be a market leader and be compliant rather than falling behind. Maryna, do I have time to briefly sort of talk about pitfalls in disclosure and greenwashing for a few minutes?
Yes, sure. Let's continue with it. Thank you.
Okay, so just a few sort of issues that we keep on picking up when we review companies' reports. So sometimes companies are tempted to paint the world greener than it actually is, or to look very compliant, but it's perhaps not quite so compliant. So first of all, the question that you need to ask in relation to your disclosure: are all the claims, are all the statements you make truthful and accurate? Are your claims clear and accurate and unambiguous? Or can they perhaps sort of hide some information or some omissions? Is there anything which in your claims or in your disclosure that hides important information? So are you clear that you only make fair and meaningful comparisons? And can you substantiate all of your points? And in particular for companies who make disclosures in relation to products, does the product or the claims in relation to the product address the entire life cycle of the product? Things that we sometimes find is, for instance, companies being vague in their disclosure. They're perhaps not quite specific enough about the materials they're using, about the CO2 footprint, or how exactly operations are affecting the climate or other ESG elements. Or companies that try and label something as green, or a do-good label to a product that is actually environmentally unfriendly. And also companies that perhaps disclose a lot of information and effectively trying to drown out the relevant information that might not be so great for the company in a heap of irrelevant information, and hoping that this will sort of drown out their own compliance issues. Sort of one of the issues that we're seeing time and time again is companies that try and suggest that the product is green based on a single environmental attribute. In the UK, there were lots of issues with that, in the way that, for instance, companies were portraying that they had electric vehicles. They're saying, our fleet of cars includes electric vehicles. And then they were making a lot of statements about that. Whereas in reality, let's say the company had 100 vans and only one of them was electric. Absolutely. This company has electric vehicles, perhaps one or two, but it's actually only a very small percentage. So in terms of disclosure, it's making statements about their company. That is an important issue. Finally, it should go without saying that fibbing or making environmental claims that are simply false is an absolute no-go, and a liability and litigation risk, and as are any statements that cannot be substantiated. Jeffrey had asked a question in relation to the time it takes to integrate ESG at boardroom level. May I ask a question back to you, Jeffrey? I'm not sure about 3 years. I've seen companies taking a bit longer, and also companies doing it in about a year or two, in about 1 or 2 accounting cycles. The mandatory regulatory framework, when they were brought in, certainly in the UK, they were foreshadowed long enough that companies had time to do so. I cannot speak for other jurisdictions. Certainly when TCFD became mandatory for listed companies, there was a lot of market information, there was a lot of this being foreshadowed, so that wasn't a surprise. Maryna, this was all I had to say. I'm really interested in the questions, your reactions,
Silke, thank you very much. My reaction first is thank you for your experience, for your practical tips. Let's maybe answer some questions that we already have. So one of them was related to liability of the company and regarding the information that can be used by other companies, so like another peers. As I can see, and as we analyze from different regulations that come into force, in some of them, there are requirements to use some information from the sector, for example, to look for peers and to understand what practices they use, what experience, what they implemented. So we are not talking about to use it against the company, but this is like to understand what another company is doing and what is the best practices and how to resolve, for example, any other issues, and to understand your role and your position between the other companies. And maybe just practical tips from my side also, when you start to look for your ESG, for your climate related journey, you also should look for your peers in your local market and also for another markets that you have. And this non-financial information, please look for it like for a financial information. So you should be transparent. You should disclose information that your company, how you operate, and this is like additional tips how to involve more capital investors and how to make more value for your company. There was great question regarding the disclosure and the problems that already companies have. So in your experience, are the companies ready to produce the reports, and do you have data about the level of readiness of companies to produce these reports? We have some information. So based on annual reports from the last years from big rating agency, also for example, our company also made some worldwide analysis. We can see that most of companies, more than 60%, as for now, they understand that the biggest problem is how to collect data, how to make it more digital, how to integrate it with process, and this is the main risks for them. So, and this is the main issue. They don't know how to manage it. And it's not about, for example, Ukraine or a European Union, this worldwide problem. Some questions you already covered. Maybe, Silke, I have one more question to you.
Sure.
Thank you for your presentation regarding the company side. But in my presentation, I also a little bit covered jurisdictions across, so different approach that we can see. And so in your, from your experience and from your cases from different countries, what should be the first steps in our countries? For example, our chapter covers not only Ukraine, but also Georgia and Armenia. So what our government should do to be in line with, for example, international standards, and how to start our national level climate journey?
Well, I'm not sure it's my position to advise anybody, any other jurisdictions or countries indeed what to do, but I think it goes a little bit in line to Natalia Gusieva's question as well, as to what sort of is there regulation. I think the most important thing that jurisdictions can do is to establish clarity. What is required of companies? The biggest difficulty is often uncertainty. When we don't know what companies really should be disclosing, to what standard should they be disclosing, because that creates sort of a salad at market level of many different types of disclosures. Nobody really knows what the market practice is and what the expectations are. Clarity is the most important part. So I would say any government anywhere needs to have a good legal basis and implement that regime, ideally in consultation with industry, and learn from one another. I often say that ESG is contagious. During the pandemic, that became a bit difficult to convey the idea, but basically, regulators talk to one another, companies talk to one another. We live in the age of globalization. We're speaking virtually across Georgia, Armenia, and Ukraine, and the UK this morning. So it is very easy to learn from other jurisdictions what they have done and how they're approaching something. I'll give you an example. The SEC in New York established certain climate change disclosure rules. Very quickly afterwards, a version of climate change disclosure rules were adopted by the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So that learning from one another and being open to see what other jurisdictions are doing and building in that flexibility and the future proofing of the regulations whilst providing certainty, I think that seems to be the most important thing for me.
Great, thank you, Silke, very much. So to continue your answer and to answer a question from our audience, is there a regulation in Ukraine introducing mandatory ESG standards? So thank you for your question, Natalia. And also I see that some of our participants, active participants, thank you very much. Also give a link to NBU. This is our banking regulatory that already published like strategy, ESG strategy, how to implement these requirements, ESG requirements into banking and financial sector industry. However, it was published in 2021. But the main thing is that it was like based on TCFD requirements. So main principles was like a background for for this strategy. And then next critical things that also maybe companies or industries, if they would like to start their journey, and that was done already by NBU, they developed like a roadmap. So what they see how to implement these requirements into next years. But as we can see in open information space, that there are no further developments. So some of activities already and movements behind, but from that time and based on that we have already war in Ukraine, so this is not was the agenda for develop and to implement. However, we have the plan how to rebuild Ukraine. If you know, a lot of discussions that the rebuilding should be green, that should be used also some international standards and approaches how to make and how to disclose and be more transparent in this part. So this is, Natalia, what we have as for now. And I know that also was a development stage, like amendment for corporate governance codex of Ukraine for some of types of companies, amendment how to improve the ESG and how to, for example, what to disclose related to remuneration, to board requirements. But official information that it was developed and it come into force, for example, and it some of frameworks that companies can use, there was no such information. Silke, we have one more question. So
Sure.
maybe you will also give some practical experience from that. What would you advise about disclosure combined with the mitigation strategy at the same time?
Is it a migration or mitigation strategy?
Migration.
Yeah, because I think there's a difference. As I think often companies do this. They say, for instance, this is our current carbon footprint, and we aim by, I don't know, 2040, 2050 to be carbon neutral or to achieve this particular other emission standard. I think it is advisable to say, like, how do you get there? But once you say, in fact, when you say how to get there, let's say you get from, I don't know, heavy oil and gas use to renewable energy in a company or something like that. If you keep on saying this over a number of years, though, without saying what you do to implement the migration strategy, I think that then becomes difficult. We see that sometimes, in particular with companies in the energy sector. We always advise do milestone reporting. So if you want to get there by 2050, and this is your migration strategy, then report on that migration strategy. Because once you've disclosed that migration strategy, expect that NGOs, regulators, the market, your investors will pick you up on that and say, hey, you said you were going to do this particular thing. You haven't done it. Why?
Okay, great, Silke. Thank you very much. So, dear participants, please feel free to put any of your questions, and now try to check. I think we, as for now, covered everything that we have. Claire, thank you very much for your link to Chapter 0 Ukraine. And dear participants, while we're waiting for your comments, we also invite you to those from you who are interested in this topic and would like to receive more information, to participate in our events, please subscribe and become our members of our chapter. Also, we educate and give more information, not only webinars. So we are hopefully to develop this topic in next years. So we have no questions as for now. Silke, maybe you have any questions to me?
No, I mean,
No.
Can I just say that I'm obviously, everybody is aware of what is going on in Ukraine, and I'm enormously impressed that in the situation, in the middle of a war, there's an organization holding up a flag for climate change and actually continuing on this very important topic at the same time. So congratulations on that, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Silke, very much. Yes, let's then sum up what we have. Like a short overview. Please, if you are looking to how to implement and what to use in your climate agenda and how to move on, please, first step, understand what requirements that come into force will be for you. So if you're working with, for example, European companies, or if you are looking for some ways how to, for example, open company in US, so different requirements can be applied for you. And yes, that the time to start is now. Please do not use time. When you start to implement, for example, TCFD, it's like a good background to be in line with other standards that developed as for now. And thank you very much. I see that we have no questions. I thank you for your time, and please, in this time, stay safe and healthy. See you on next events. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.